Ludwig van Beethoven, the musical genius of late 18th century, early 19th century classicism. By the sheer force of the gripping, concentrated energy of his music, the bold contrasts, the dynamism of his rhythmic power, he invigorated the sonata form until it became a living human thing. The first movements of his early sonatas allow us to hear the ideal balance between the logic of articulated form and the passion of early Romanticism's musical poetry. Today, we shall be talking about the model of the master's sonata form. That model upon which was built the masterpieces of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and which sets up a design for a century and a half of musical structures. Last week, we talked about minuet and trio, A, B, A. And we said that one of the principal features of that, both in musical terms and as far as the psychology of the listener is concerned, is the principle of recurrence, not only in the external structures of A with the inner B section, but also inside each of those component blocks of time passing, the principle that you set up an idea, you repeat it, you digress from that idea with a contrasting section, and then you return to it. Now, this principle of return and a structure divided into three sections, but bisected into two relatively equal sections that we find in the minuet and trio of mid-18th century music, is the foundation for the larger form known as sonata form. We can illustrate that in this way, and you will see the manner in which this derives from minuet structure. First of all, in a sonata movement, you have a first subject group in which an idea is stated, very clearly defining the key in which the piece is written, and very clearly defining a mood, either by a memorable, smooth lyrical theme, or more likely than not, a very aggressive gesture, a very rhythmically powerful one that is very readily remembered, that leaps to the mind as soon as you hear it. This desire for an oral recognition factor is very important in a music passing through time in which the subdivisions of that time must be recognized by the listener, recognized by his apprehension of where we are at in the form, by the arrival and the recurrence of these initial ideas. Hence, the readily graspable musical gesture that must occur right at the beginning of such a movement. The element of contrast then enters, a contrast which we express by this lighter shade. This is the so-called second subject group. More often than not, it is separated from the first subject group by a moment of silence, a cadence point. It offers contrast to the first subject group, not only for reasons of aesthetic pleasure, but also to clearly identify it as something different, something unique in its own right from the material of the first, so that, again, in the listener's realization of the time passing, he knows where he is at. He is comfortable in the rationale of this music. He's comfortable in its musical structural logic, that logic which is so much a part of this music of the age of reason. A first subject group then, a contrasting second subject group, and then a return to action similar to that of the first subject group in a relatively short section known as the codetta, or closing group. Now you will see that the proportions of first group and second and third subject group relate quite clearly to those proportions that were inside the minuet that we heard in the previous program. The articulation of first and second subject group by the silence does not occur between the second subject group and the closing, and in fact is quite often is a matter for analysts' debate as to where a closing group begins, where a second subject group ends. Sufficient for us to know that we are dealing with something which exposes a sequence of musical ideas that are contrasted with each other. And so this section as a whole is called the exposition. Principles of classical balance and equilibrium are satisfied then by having as the latter portion of the movement in sonata form a recapitulation, a rehearing of the material in the exposition, usually in the same order. Some things of variety may occur with some of this material, but the articulation of the recapitulation made by the listener's ability to apprehend the initial musical gesture is a crucial one, and one which the composer must guarantee the success of by creating such an orally articulate and easily identifiable idea. The section is relatively equal length to the exposition. Exposition, recapitulation, the outer balances of the classical arch, but now filled with a great deal of contrast, a great deal of drama and action. The central point of the classical arch, which we represent by this shorter block, which is symbolic of the fact that, of course, in the material, this musical material does tend to be shorter than its outer elements in the early sonatas, is a period of digression, a discursive section. It meant something different for each of our principal composers of musical classicism, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. In general, we can say it is an area in which the ideas set up in the exposition, sometimes the first, sometimes the second, sometimes the combination of these in the closing group, are played with, are sent through different keys. Harmony is changed. Lyric passages are extended. There is a feeling of tension growing, because how long is this structure? How wide the facade of the classical arch? How far are we traveling in that dynamism through musical time before we descend to the musical realization of that equilibrium in the recapitulation? Haydn, and particularly Beethoven, capitalized upon the ambiguity of the end of the development section to increase the drama of a sonata form. And you will hear that in the compositions played in the course of this program. The delay of the final cadence from this area of excursion to the return of that easily recognizable initial gesture. Therein lies that dynamism we talked about. The ability to take a model and use it. This as the model of the masters, but that which defined the master was his ability to use that model and let it serve his purposes. And so we have a different kind of an arch. An expository section of contrasting ideas, an excursion, and then the recapitulation of those ideas to satisfy our needs of balance, our need of security for the satisfaction of our musical ear. Now let's demonstrate what we've been talking about by listening to the first movement of the Sonata in C minor, Opus 10, number 1, by Beethoven. First of all, these are the ideas, the apprehension of which will enable you to follow Beethoven's course through time passing, through his musical architecture. I mentioned the ability to arrest the listener with a very exciting idea. It grabs you. You cannot mistake where you are when you hear something like this. That is the first theme, or the initial motif of the first subject group. Having worked his way along with that idea, there is a moment of silence. And then we move to that contrasting area. The contrast now not of rough, jagged gesture and rhythm, but of a smooth, lyric, singing idea. The closing section, that is this little section here, gathers up the two types of gesture we've had. The jagged rhythm and the smooth idea, now cast in a very reflective manner. Silence. End of section. Clear demarcation of where we are at. The central section of excursion is marked by both an extension of the dramatic gesture through a series of harmonic changes and an extension of the lyric idea, creating a new, longer melody out of the shorter one. Then there is a passage of ambiguity. Where are we? When are we going to finish? When are we going to come home? And then there's no escaping where we are, because we recognize that initial dramatic gesture. We are back here. And our composer takes us through these ideas again. At the close of the work, the meditative passage returns, and Beethoven declares where we are at, the end of his moment of time passing, by the short, sharp, punctuating chords so common to his musical style. We know where we are. We have finished that experience of sonata form. Here then, this first movement of the C minor sonata, opus 10, number 1, and realize as we are listening to it how the model may remain constant from one sonata to the next, but how our composer invigorates us through our articulated musical architecture. Lynn Stodola will play this first movement from the Beethoven C minor sonata. sonata form, the model of the masters of Viennese classicism, the model of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. That model gives us the cohesion, the rationale upon which is built the musical architecture. It is the master that must give it the life, the passion, the lyricism. This you have heard in the C minor sonata. We'll hear it again in the contrasting mode. This time the major key, the sonata opus 14, number 2, in G major. Here both ideas tend to be light and lyrical. The first an arabesque, da-dee-da-da-dee-da-dum, da-dee-da-da-da-dum. The second, just that little bit more sprightly. The form is extended in time. It is not as compact as the sonata movement you just heard, but it is intact. And with it you would then have a contrast not only of mood, but also a contrast in the composer's ability to handle length of time, to stretch, to play with his model, and still keep that equilibrium necessary for the realization of classicism in musical architecture. As you listen to this movement, notice that we have tried to time the pictures of Beethoven's life to fit the various subsections of the musical form. And with this little extra visual identification, perhaps this may help you to apprehend that which is so essential in the appreciation of such music, this balance between content and form. Lynn Stodola gives us this first movement from the Opus 14 G major sonata by Beethoven.
you.